Hello and welcome to Cognilibre's website. In this interview, we're going to talk about constructive development theory and give a more foundational approach to where it came from and, more importantly, where it's going to. What emerges out of constructive development theory are a number of ways of addressing coaching, mentoring, stage development, and other ways of constructing our thinking in the moment. And with the help of Sean, we're going to discuss constructive development theory and where it's going.
It's great to be here again with you, Darren. In fact, it's great to be here in person rather than on Zoom as we were last time. What we didn't cover last time was really your journey and how you became interested in adult development and how you got to CDT from that. So maybe you could start off by telling the viewers about that.
I think, like a lot of people, I started on the self-development course via neuro-linguistic programming, so NLP. I had a very good teacher in Frank Daniels and another one called Jeff Dowell, and I did probably 5 years of NLP, practitioner, master practitioner, that kind of thing. And then when I left that, I was thinking, well, I'm a master practitioner now, so what? What do I do now? And Jeff mentioned there's a program called the Identity Compass. That was more about profiling people and figuring out how they think. And I thought, well, that's pretty useful. And I'd already started a psychology degree at that point, so I thought they could marry together quite nicely.
Yeah.
I then started to use the Identity Compass once I qualified to go into organisations and profile people. And I did it with a guy who was a friend of my wife at the time. And he had just moved to a university in London. And I said to him, why don't we profile students? You know, we could, especially the master's level students, we can see how they think. And he thought that was a good idea. That was about 2012. By the time 2014 came along, he'd called me up. I'd profiled him at least once. And we developed something called the High Flyers program in the university, where MBA students can they can choose to join in this program, and they start with a profile. What I noticed was that depending on where the students came from, that could have been Nigeria, China, Korea, Japan, it didn't really matter. But what was interesting was their thinking was relatively similar. And I noticed that if they thought this way, the profile looked one way, but if they thought this way, the profile looked a different way. This coincided with me looking at a guy called Robert Keegan and another guy called Otto Lasky and their levels of development, which we've mentioned in other places. So I said to Jeff, can we map an external person's perspective onto Keegan's level 3 using the Identity Compass profile? He said no, but I did it anyway. And what I noticed over time was I could map someone who thought externally, partner, caring for others, to Keegan's socialized mind. And from there, I got about 200 students profiled, and I decided to take the studies further. And that's kind of where the idea for dynamic intelligence came from. The more balanced you are across these, what I've called cognitive intentions, the more capable you are of choosing. So I took the ideas from what I did with the students and turned it into a PhD to really validate the approach. And out of the PhD came constructive development theory.
Excellent. So I know from previous discussions with you that within constructive development theory tells us how we can move between stages in the different stage transition approaches. And previously we've talked about Keegan and Lasky, you just mentioned there, but I know that you've been doing some work on some other types of stage theories. Do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, because this is a really important point, because when you look at any stage development system in adult development, right, you've got all the way from Michael Commons, Jane Lervinger, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, all the way up to Lasky Keegan. What they do is they describe the levels brilliantly, and you know, at the top level of one of them, it will be described in a certain way, which is going to be very similar to the way another stage developmentalist describes it. However, what I addressed in my thesis and what I addressed in my theory is that they don't tell you how to move from like achiever to the next level in Lervinger's system. They don't tell you specifically what to change, what to tweak in their thinking in order to move. Now, a guy called Granot said that we have these things called bridges and shells. And I won't go into too much detail, but basically we create a bridge to the next level. And the empty bridge, the empty shell, is devoid of information. And we fill that information up with the ideas at the next level, and it pulls us towards the next level. That's not enough. I know, it's a tough one. And I probably didn't do it any justice in my talk just then. But what I want to know is, what's the difference between this level in any system and this level, right? And I've just mapped my theory to spiral dynamics. Okay. So we've heard of Ken Wilber, Don Beck, and people, Claire Graves, people like this. So if I want to move from green to yellow, I've mapped that, and I can now tell you specifically which cognitive intentions are important for green, which are important for yellow, and how to tweak them in order to grow your thinking. No one's done that before. And that I'm working with another organization as well called Potentialization. And I've pretty much done that for them, but it is a really cool way of mapping stages, and it transfers from Lervinger all the way up to spiral dynamics using my system.
Excellent. So when you're talking there about what you can tweak to move between the levels in any system, that sounds like it's got a really strong application in coaching. So how does your system translate then into a system for coaching?
Well, first of all, out of my framework comes a more ethical approach to coaching. So if we recall on one of the other videos, I have the awareness quotient, which determines how self-aware you are. So from a coaching perspective, a coach who's at the lower levels of my AQ system will not be able to coach a person who's at the higher levels. We've been through this, haven't we?
Yeah.
What we do now is we look at it from a more complex other perspective. Vygotsky created this thing called the zone of proximal development, where children are given the answers, the strategies to take their thinking to the next level, right? From a child perspective. We're all adults. We've done all that.
Yeah.
From an adult perspective, I don't need someone to give me the answer. I need someone as a coach to say, have you thought about thinking about it like this? Have you thought about thinking about it like this? And what they're doing is, because they've got a more complex approach in their thinking, they can see my patterns. They can see the patterns that I can't see, and they point out where my thinking might be limited. And they offer an alternate perspective, which is my gap. So it could be, from a cognitive intention perspective, it could be abstract and concrete, and they can see more concrete than I can. And that bit is pretty much their superpower, because they see their pattern, and I don't see that pattern. So from a coaching perspective, more complex other is key. And this is what separates this type of coaching from first generation, second generation, and third generation coaching. You're familiar with those.
Yep.
And people watching might be familiar with that as well.
Yeah, so do you want to tell us a little bit about what the key kind of concept within first generation, second generation, and third generation coaching that's so different when you move into what you're calling coaching 2, I believe?
Yeah, coaching 2.0, like human 2.0, that kind of thing. Off the top of my head, I mean, first generation coaching was a bit more procedural and a bit more goal oriented and that kind of thing. By the time they got to Stettler at third generation coaching, it was a bit more emotionally led. Mm-hmm. And it's still being used a lot today. Okay. Oh, things like the GROW model, procedural first generation, right? What differentiates mine, and the reason why I haven't called my stuff fourth generation, is because it's a separation of how we think about our clients. So I'm not here to make an emotional relationship with my client like it says in third generation. I'm not bestowed to my client on how they respond and react to me is going to influence how I'm going to respond to them. Now, of course, there's going to be an element of that, but it's not from the emotional position that's put forward in third generation coaching. Instead, the way coaching 2.0 looks at this is, you get a client, they come to you with a problem. However, what they don't realize is that the problem isn't the problem they've come to you with. The problem is a problem of construction. And what I mean by that is, how the client constructs their problem is limited by their own level of construction.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So my job as a coach, first and foremost, I have to be a level above the client.
Yep.
That's the ethical framework you mentioned.
Yep.
Right? If I'm not a level above the client, I can't see their patterns, I can't coach them. It's that simple. There's no first, second, third generation. You can't coach them. Okay? This is what the other generations don't take into account. Now, to give Dr. Lasky his dues, I'm not the first to say this. He mentioned this himself a few years ago. but he came at it from his perspective, which is fantastically academic, and it doesn't translate as well as what we're talking about here today. So once you've got the idea that the coach has to be a level above the client, you then realize that how the client constructs a problem is limited by their level, and you help them with their construction. Which means that if they say this is the problem, after the 1, 2, 3 series of coaching that you go through, maybe 6 sessions, whatever, they look at the problem again, you've tweaked those individual cognitive intentions, they now have a different way of constructing their own thinking. What happens to the problem?
That becomes something different, doesn't it?
It
Maybe
does.
goes away.
It does. And the person that is procedural and only procedural doesn't see any options. But a coach, I beg your pardon, who can see all the options, can offer this client some more options that they can't see. Well, the problem is derived from the fact that they don't see anything else. In one example, they're just procedures. Well, this is how we always do it. Yeah. And this is the main point, the main difference between Coaching 2.0 is we look at the construction of the client first and foremost.
And how would you go about that? Can you give us some kind of sense for what that feels like in a coaching session? What is it that you're looking for in the client specifically?
First of all, they will need to do an identity compass profile.
Yep.
What that does is it breaks down their thinking into the 50 different cognitive intentions. Mm-hmm. And from that, I will derive a score that is based on 1, on Kegan's system, social emotional thinking or self-authored thinking, and 2, based on my system, which is basically how at choice they are.
Yep.
Now, the 4 pillars of constructive development are intention, awareness, choice, and response. And I look at how they do each of those cognitive intentions from an IACR perspective, which seems long-winded and really, really in-depth. But as you start to get better at this, you do it on the fly.
Yeah.
And you can ask questions in real time, and you can gauge just how at choice they are from their language. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in the coaching session, we use the identity compass to determine those things, and we pick I say 3 cognitive intentions that are the most limiting in their thinking.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, they can only work on 1. We think that we're capable of working on more. We're not. We're not. We think we're good at. No. If your towards and away from is out, and your abstract and concrete is out, I can't give you both of those things to work on. So, at my age, it will probably take me a month or 2 to get to the balance stage, or the point where I've got a choice.
On just one cognitive intention?
On just one cognitive intention.
Wow.
Right? Now, this does tie in with a number of other developmental psychologists who say that it could, in theory, take 2 years before you actually go to the next stage. However, and you know this because I can disrupt your thinking like that in the moment, but that disrupts you and stretches you, but it doesn't mean you live there.
Yeah.
So even for me, even though it's my theory, that doesn't mean I'm level 10, AQ 10. It means I'm AQ 8 and a bit. I can still have my own thinking tweaked because I'm not at choice with everything. You know what I mean? So with that in mind, a month, 2 months down the line, then you might come back for your second session and we go through what you've worked on in the coaching. I will ask you questions based on the cognitive intentions you're not getting. It's about disrupting your pattern. Yeah. I'm not going to ask you questions where you know and it's easy. I'm going to ask the opposite because that's where the stretch is.
Yeah.
And that's the guiding principles behind Coaching 2.0. Where's the stretch? Where's the disruption?
Okay, so if I take the example that you used there about someone that was highly procedural versus someone that's highly options. I mean, I know myself from coaching, if you try to get someone that is procedural to give you options on how they might achieve something, then they can't. But what I would then be doing, I guess, is giving them some form of disruption, something to take away where they can practice that, and then be challenging that one and come back and asking them tell me about the options that you've generated, tell me about when you've used options, and try to push them in that direction. Is that the basics of what you're saying?
Yeah, because as you give them things to do, they're called interventions.
Yeah.
So you give them an intervention and you get them to practice it over and over again. Not so that they go like this and it reverses, but so eventually they get like this. Now, from an intervention perspective, So I would find out if if you're not using options, how are you using it? When they come back into the coaching session afterwards, say they've been doing it a month or so, by asking them, tell me the times when you've used the new options intervention that you've just had. Not only do they then tell you about what they've done, by remembering what they've done, they reinforce the options thinking and patterns that they are now remembering that they've done. So it's a kind of a double whammy on top.
Yeah, they're strengthening their neural pathways.
That's exactly
basically creating new neural pathways.
And this is why, and I didn't want to say it, but this is why at my age it takes a bit longer, because the neural pathways are quite set. So if I want to create if I only do internal, in order to do external, I have to create new neural pathways. It takes longer at my age. If it were my kids, it wouldn't take them any time at all. It's just the way it is, isn't it? So, give them. So, which is another important thing from a coaching 2.0 perspective. Recognize your clients, where your client comes from.
Yeah.
Where they are. Where are they now? How do they turn up? If you're 20, it's different to if you're 40 or 50.
Greater neuroplasticity.
And a lot of research comes out now that says neuroplasticity keeps going. So we're good to go for about another 20 years, 30 years, maybe 40 years.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good to know. So we've talked about more complex other MCOs in.
Oh, yeah.
So you're always going to be a level higher than the person that you're coaching, or ideally at least one level higher. Do you take the same approach for everybody on a different level? So would you coach someone that's an AQ 7 the same way as you would at someone at an AQ 6 or an AQ 5?
No, that's a really good point. The reason for the MCO, more complex other. So if you're a coach, say you go through the Coaching 2.0 system and you want to train as an MCO coach with my system, right? You have a different understanding at MCO 5, which you're not really going to be coaching anybody at MCO 5 because we've already established that. MCO 6, you're borderline coaching. You're really just having dialogue. But MCO 7, 8, 9, there are differences in how they construct their thinking, but more importantly, in how they can see your patterns.
So Darren, when we think about coaching, we've talked about people being at different levels, the clients themselves. So the way that you approach coaching someone at an AQ 7, does that differ from the way that you approach coaching someone at an AQ 5? Is there a difference in that? Does a level of awareness that the client has make a difference to the way that you have to coach them?
Absolutely. Because what you take for granted that the coach, the client at AQ 7 is going to be more aware of their thinking than the client at AQ 5. That's what the awareness quotient tells you. If a lot of people don't like the ideas of scales where 7 is better than 6 is better than. However, if you think about it from this perspective, a person at AQ 7 has more self-awareness, but is more at choice in their thinking and behaving than a person at AQ 5. But the AQ 5, you'll have more imbalances to choose from, right? At AQ 8, if it were me coaching them, it'd probably be more of a developmental dialogue in the sense that we're going to be relatively on par.
Yeah.
Now, what I have noticed in my system is that it will also determine if they're massively external, perhaps they need coaching. If they're massively internal and low level, then perhaps they need therapy. And this is the only system out there that can determine between the lower levels who need therapy, the next level up who needs coaching, and the next level up who needs developmental dialogue. And no other system gives you this kind of breakdown from a coaching perspective.
No, I was going to say that it's very different from all of the approaches that I've seen before, where they give you an approach and they assume that you can use that with anybody. That's very different.
That's exactly it. And I've been to many talks, many conferences where they assume that as long as you have a core coaching process, it works with everyone. It really doesn't. It just doesn't. And we need to move away from this idea, because there are international coaching organizations that teach this. But I know that they're not able to necessarily differentiate between what their practitioner coach is and what their master coach is. Well, my system will give you that differentiation. Or if they ask me for it, it will give them that differentiation. Because we know that at the lower levels, they don't do a lot from a balance perspective. At the higher levels, they do.
Yeah. So we've talked about the differences in the way that you would coach someone where the client are at different AQ levels. What about the coach themselves? How does a coach at AQ 7 or AQ 8, do they coach differently? Is there anything different in the way that they coach?
Yeah, if you wanted to come along and do the constructive developmental coaching program with Cognitive Libro, what we would do is we would start off at the lower levels, and what we call it is MCO6, more complex other six. I mentioned it earlier,
Yeah.
right? We go through the process of developing how you think so that you recognize the patterns of the person opposite. Now, if you're at 6, you're only going to recognize the patterns of people around your level and lower.
Mm-hmm.
If you're at 8, you have more choice. You can see more things. You see more patterns in the way your client thinks. Now, from an MCO 8 perspective, you start to understand the nuances of cognitive intentions. For example, can you have a towards idea? Can you be towards away from, which is a different intention? So if you were towards, that's not the same as being away from. And we go through that. So there's a difference between what you're taught and how you're taught it in order to gauge and coach your clients' levels. So the higher up the MCO scale you go, the more nuanced, the more detailed your understanding of cognitive intentions and constructive development theory. Because what we're actually talking about is intention, awareness, choice, response. Are they aware of it? How does it construct their unique thinking style? So there are 7 billion people on the planet. There are at least 7 billion thinking styles. Other systems like the MBTI do not give you this kind of information, right? But this system does. We can tell you specifically your thinking style, how those 50 cognitive intentions combine creates your thinking style. And that's unique to you. And we can tweak your thinking style to take you up to the next level. The coach will be taught how to understand your thinking style as long as it's below their thinking style.
So if we think about that from a supervision level, then it almost sounds like it's baked in to some respect because you're only ever coaching people below you. But what is the supervision model then beyond that within Coaching 2.0?
It is a good question because if we take the MCO levels, let's say we have a pool of coaches who are MCO 6, a pool of coaches who are MCO 7. So when you come along to the training, and it's really development, it's not really training because you'll do the identity compass first. You will get an AQ score, right? And let's say you come out at 6.8. Well, do I put you in the MCO 7 category or the MCO 6 category? Well, for me, you're more towards 7. So it would be better for you and us as an association for you to tweak your thinking to get you up to MCO 7 so that you can start to develop and coach 7s and 6s and 5s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Now, the same principle will be the same for the 8s and the 6s. A supervisor who comes out at AQ6 will not really be supervising many coaches because they're at 6. And what I want to ensure is, as an organization, as an association, we must ensure that we have integrity and the ethical framework that I mentioned earlier, that those at the higher levels can coach everybody below them, but the ones at the lower levels need to develop their own thinking first as coaches before they start moving up and coaching all the other people. No other organization does this. I know of one guy in Australia who I'm in contact with who has a very, very similar idea. However, he uses Wilbur to do his ideas, whereas this is obviously constructive development theory.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
That's it. That's all my questions, Darren. Thanks very much for your time.
No, that's great, because now what we've done now is we've worked out the ideas behind constructive development theory, how it translates to coaching. And if you're interested in understanding how Coaching 2.0 is fundamentally and epistemologically different to the existing generations of coaching, get in touch today and we can tell you when the next training course is. Thank you very much.